from others. I call Gerry Carroll.
Having read through the document at length over the weekend, Mr Deputy Speaker, and having read through it again and again, I can't help but think that it's not a draft programme for government at all, but is in fact 114 pages of concentrated waffle, designed to deflect from an already pre-agreed programme of Thatcherite austerity. And there are plenty of aspirations in this document, many of which I would agree with, and no doubt many members in the House, in this chamber, would agree with. But in the end, the devil is in the detail, and action speaks louder than words. Take the aspiration to reduce poverty, for example. An important and laudable aspiration, but what does this mean in practice? We know, for example, that benefit cuts will increase poverty. We know that job losses will increase poverty. We know that the bedroom tax, which is coming in 2020, will increase poverty. And we know that all this is contained in the Fresh Start agreement. So how can we reconcile the reality of an austerity programme like the Fresh Start agreement with an aspiration to reduce poverty? The truth is the executive cannot. Again, there is an aspiration in this document to improve mental health, and of course everyone here in this chamber would welcome this. But how can we square this with a situation where in the areas with the highest levels of suicide and areas where they are most affected by issues associated with mental health, North and West Belfast, there is a disgraceful plan to close down mental health centres in these areas? What use is this aspiration to the users of Everton and Whiterock mental health centres in Belfast? What's more, Mr Speaker, how can any aspiration to reduce poverty or improve public services be reconciled by an economic plan taken straight from the Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan playbook? To reduce tax on corporations and to give big business handouts, the last 30 years of neoliberalism has taught us that there is no such thing as trickle-down economics. It doesn't exist and it doesn't work. In reality, the Fresh Start agreement is a plan to send wealth upwards to the cost of hundreds of millions of pounds, which will be paid by the taxpayer and the public sector. There is, Mr Speaker, an alternative to this right-wing economics advocated by the executive. It's one based not on cutting the tax on corporations, but making the rich pay. It's an alternative that doesn't seek to set aside millions of pounds, as the Fresh Start agreement indicates, to go after so-called benefit fraud, but instead sets money aside to go after the real fraudsters who avoid paying millions and billions of pounds in taxes. And there are more multi-millionaires per head of population in Belfast than in any other city here in the north or in Britain, except in London and oil-rich Aberdeen. And a socialist alternative, Mr Speaker, says make them pay. And why not abolish the rate system and replace it with a progressive local income tax where the rich pay the most, or at least remove the cap on rates on the wealthiest? Why don't we stop wasting hundreds of millions of pounds on wasteful PFI schemes? Why don't we end the wasteful voluntary redundancy scheme where £700 million is being set aside to put people out of work? Why don't we use £700 million to build homes and to put people in work? And it's not about a lack of money, Mr Speaker, it's about priorities. If it was about lack of money, then this House wouldn't have consistently afforded itself a pay raise when it was telling everyone else to take pay freeze or pay cuts. And this House has failed a vast majority of people here for too long. Now, we'd be very doubtful that this programme for government represents anything different. Indeed, the introduction to this document says that its progress cannot be judged in a single Assembly term, but rather can only be judged in a generation's time. Well, Mr Speaker, I want to make it clear that we don't have a generation to wait for this House to get its act together. Public sector workers, hard-working staff in places like the Royal Victoria Hospital don't have a generation to wait for the living wage. The LGBT community can't wait a generation to see its right to equal marriage granted. Those in child poverty won't even be children in a generation, and they can't be expected to wait either. Women who are being prosecuted because they want to control their own bodies can't wait for a generation. And the Irish language community, the pioneers of Bohershoy, or the thousands of people following in their footsteps in schools like College de Firtia have waited long enough for their rights, and I'm sure they won't be prepared to sit back and wait to see if Stormont sorts things out in a generation either. And of course, the thousands of people who want to see a future free from sectarianism and communal bickering cannot be expected to wait a generation when they've already had to wait at least 20 years. I'd like to remind this House in closing, and anyone else that's watching, what Stormont does, people and the workers can undo. And even if the programme for government goes through, which it likely will, it won't be the end of the matter, because the day of reckoning is yet to come, and it's coming soon for the austerity mongers on both sides of the chamber. Thank you very much.